warm welcome, everyone, to Intersections, where our quest is to dissolve boundaries and to explore our full potential individually, but also collectively. What does it mean for us in groups and communities, as humanity and as individuals to shine through with our full potential? Today, I have with us Ai-jen Poo. She is a next generation labor leader. She's an award-winning organizer and a leading voice in the women's movement. She's the president of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization that works to win respect and recognition and labor rights and protections for the nearly 2.5 million nannies and house cleaners and home care workers across America. She's also the executive director of Caring Across Generations, which is a national organization of family caregivers, care workers, disabled people, and aging adults working to transform the way we care in this country. She's a nationally recognized expert on the care economy and has authored the celebrated book, The Age of Dignity. I also want to say personally that it's a great joy to recognize that Ai-jen is a product of Columbia University, which, as many of you know, is one of my very, very sweet homes here in New York City. So Ai-jen, warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be with you.
Yeah, so grateful, so grateful. I tell you, there's so much about your work which is so heartwarming and also so illuminating for the kind of times we live in today, so necessary and critical for the kinds of time we live in today. I know that we will zoom in on things that you have so deeply invested in with so much heart and spirit, and they relate to, among other things, the theme of caregiving. And what really is so energizing for me as we start this conversation is both through the way you approached it and the principles and practices that you put into application. I see that your story is my story. Your story is everybody's story. And that is, in fact, one of the principles that I've sort of recognized from looking at some of the great noble movements and change makers in the world, that they find a way to make their message very universal. It might be very focused on a moment in human history and for a particular community, but somehow underlying it is some kind of timeless and universal truth. And reminds me of a Leonardo da Vinci quote. He once said, study the art in science and study the science in art, and then approach problems through the lens that everything connects with everything else, and you're able to make that happen in a very lived way. So that's so beautiful.
Well, thank you so much. I find it just a joy to work on an issue like caregiving, where there's just not a room that I go into where people don't have deeply personal, emotional, and profound experiences to share about caregiving, either caring for someone else or relying upon care themselves or bearing witness to care, and just having this common experience that can anchor and create the context for connections is such a beautiful thing. And I feel very lucky. And it's a good reminder that we, in a world where it feels like we are more divided than ever, in fact, there are some enduring shared experiences that we have that are the basis for us to reconnect and find common ground. That also feels like an exciting proposition right now.
Yeah, I want to come back to that connective tissue aspect of what caring can be for humanity. I see in you somebody who is deeply invested in service and keen attunement with humanity's needs and hungers, and you're so dedicated to it. I'm curious, when did it sort of come to you, the awareness and spark that, this is the step I want to take? And when did it come to you that this is not just a step I'm taking, this is actually almost like a life purpose that I'm forming?
It's a good question. I never know how to answer this question, because it's not as though there was one moment or one decision or even a series of them. I do think that given my parents and their values, that was natural that I would want to be of service, and started volunteering at a very early age. My mother often tells the story of when I was in first grade or kindergarten, and I saw on the news reporting about a famine in Ethiopia. And I proceeded to bake cookies so that I could sell them in front of the grocery store to raise money for famine relief. I have no memory of this, of course. And I was quite entrepreneurial about it. Apparently, she said that I ran out of cookies, but I still had more customers. So I went into the grocery store, bought a box of cookies, repackaged them, and sold them. um, but all this to say is that even from a young age, I think I was inclined to try to be of service. And I think as I grew older, I just met individuals like caregivers and domestic workers, especially as a young woman, who I learned so much from and who lived this profound contradiction between the things that are most important in life, like caring for the people we love, and the fact that the work that they do and the roles of caregiving is so invisibilized and so undervalued that contradiction or that seeming hypocrisy, it was enraging to me as a young woman. And I think just following their courage and their stories and their desire to realize a different future for themselves and for their children was inspiration to me. And I just kind of kept following the women, and never looked back. And it wasn't a conscious decision, oh, I'm going to be an organizer for the rest of my life, or I'm going to build this organization. I just kind of listened and learned and tried to bring people together. And, through trial and error, really, I kept going.
Yeah. Wow. I'm processing. I'm processing. You talk about the contradictions and then the hypocrisy, and it still takes a capacity to be really brutally honest, with yourself and with your relationship with humanity in the world to be able to step back and actually acknowledge that and process that, and then feel like I'm going to act on that, to resolve that contradiction, to actually address that hypocrisy, rather than just kind of let it pass me by and keep living from one day to the next in the sphere of sort of material accomplishments and gain that many people get swept up by. There's a sense I'm getting from even just these early glimpses that we're getting into your story, that there's a certain wholeness, that you have possessed from a very early stage within you, so that you showed up in life and in the world and didn't feel compelled to go into perhaps more mainstream, formulaic, popular kind of, lanes and paths, because you had to prove something to the world, because you had to fit in some ways, or etc. Some of these pressures and demands that, painfully so and naturally so, so much humanity sometimes in that formative age and stage of high school and college sometimes spaces. Yeah. So a sense of wholeness. So, that is in any way sort of resonant. Can you give a little insight into your inner life? Like, where do you think that has come from for you?
Well, when I was very young and my parents were still graduate students, new immigrants, graduate students, I think they had me just a couple years into immigrating to the US. I lived with my grandparents. My paternal grandmother came to the US to help care for me after I was born. And then I went back to Taiwan to live with her because my parents actually struggled to afford childcare. And so the role that my grandparents have played in my upbringing is just profound. I can't overstate how significant it was. And I'm so grateful for that experience because they've given me a connection to a history and to a set of values and perspectives that I think were just in me, in my DNA, that we should honor our elders, that we should always be generous and look for ways to take care of other people, and the kind of values that people who survived war and poverty and migration and built over and over again in the face of that, those kind of values. And my grandmother's joy in all of it. I mean, she's believed that if you laughed 3 times a day, deep belly laughs, at least 3 times a day, you'll live a very long and healthy life. And one day you'll just have a heart attack and die. And that's how you all want to go anyway. This is kind of how she lived, honestly and joyfully, through many, many hardships. And I think that is really a part of how I came to grow up feeling like I wanted to just be of service and feel grateful that I could along the way.
Well, we're shouting out heartfelt thank you to your grandparents for what they did to shape you and form you, and look what a multiplicative impact it's having in the world. So beautiful. one of the things that, of course, is America's strength is its diversity. And part of the value of that diversity is that America is always a work in progress. It's always forming and reforming. And part of that is because these different cultures come here and meld in, certain very unique ways, isn't it? And I do think that, that we should strive to recognize something very timeless and something very unique to what America is and has sought to manifest in its own imperfect ways and, evolutionary ways since its very inception. But even with those timeless things, there's a certain sort of things that are evolving it. And what I notice in your story is that reverence, that you highlight that there exists in certain cultures. You come from an Asian culture, I come from an Asian culture from India, and certainly I can vouch for as much in India as you do so articulately from some other Asian cultures as to the appreciation and place of honor, that we give to the elders. And the older you are, the more naturally so, there's a central place and space for you in every community event, in every family event. You're the center of it all because you're calling the shots because you're the oldest. So there's almost this natural instinctual something. And yet, we come to America and somehow we very quickly put these people a little bit on the sidelines of society, and you hardly see them and you hardly deal with them, and it's considered a little bit of an encumbrance or an inconvenience. And anyway, so I just wanted to share that because I'm just framing this for our listeners, and I'm just wanting to share with you how much I appreciate and relate to that ethos that perhaps comes a little bit from your immigrant Asian background, that can perhaps now be of service to helping again mold and soften and evolve America into the next phase of its growth, right? So anyway, can you talk a little bit to that?
Sure. I mean, I do really think a lot about the fact that in other countries, people look forward to aging and becoming an elder. That is my aspiration for us in this country, because in the United States, because truly the thing that everyone forgets is that aging is living. If we are lucky, we are aging, all of us. And our failure to embrace the fact that aging is living means that we miss opportunities for intergenerational connection, for older people to be able to contribute the kind of wisdom and insight that only comes from living more days on planet Earth. And also, if we designed our future and our society and our culture and our systems to support quality of life for a longer lifespan, because we are actually all living longer, there are enormous opportunities inside of that as well. I know there's many organizations who are working on second and third acts because people are living so long that they can have multiple careers and multiple lifetimes in one lifetime. There's more and more people thinking about intergenerational care programs because of all the data that shows how older adults and very young children, when you put them together, real magic happens in terms of health outcomes, mental health, both for older people and for the young children who get that exposure. So there's just so many benefits to us fully embracing our multi-generational reality and future. And I fear that we miss out on those opportunities if we avoid a conversation about aging and or fear it the way that I think we're culturally disposed to.
Yeah. A thought that's coming to my mind is how maybe at the root of it is our obsession and identification in the West, in America, for example, with our material identity as our identity, right? So if you think about your body and if you think about how fast you can run, how pretty you look and things like that, those are all aspects of our material physical identity. If that is the sole identity that you kind of really take on, then as the body ages, it looks like you're going on the decline,
Mm.
right? But if part of the identity was something to do with your spirit, with your soul, with the enrichment of perspectives and the library of stories that you now carry within you, or things like that, and society were to also savor that and draw that out of you, then perhaps we might start to change the thinking, right? So in other words, it is about aging, but it's also about the intangible, deeper aspects of who we are. I don't know. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think if we associate aging with decline, we will, of course, not want to embrace it. And the truth of it is that there's so much growth and evolution in the aging process and renewal. I mean, honestly, living longer means longer to learn and to grow and to connect and to love and to contribute. And that is a beautiful thing. But we have to design our future differently to support that. Because right now, as you said, everything is really oriented towards the perfect and almost impossible body and state of health.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And of course, at the very end of that lies a door that none of us will be able to, escape from. At some point, the door will open and invite us to go through it. And you talk a little bit about that too, as a critical reframing of a relationship that we, need to make in society. And that's the door of death. My father passed away a few years ago, and he had a beautiful life, a blessed life. And in India, which is where he lived, when I went back for his cremation, which is what we do in India, we cremate the body. I realized how different the experience is in India of sanctifying that moment and playing a role in that moment as a member of the family and all of that, than the very polished kind of funeral home experience that we have in the United States. And part of it is just the viscerality of actually seeing the body, of the even getting to have to touch it, as you kind of help support it, like with the right clothes or things that it has to wear for its final departure to the cremation ground, and then you go and cremate the body. So as a child would light the fire to the pyre, where the body is. And then you come back, you watch it, kind of being cremated and burned. And then you come back the next early morning to collect the ashes in a cask. And in doing so, there might be a few sort of like even little bones, or something, but most of it is ashes. And, of course, there's a heaviness of heart. But at the same time, there's such a lesson life is teaching you. There's such a lesson teaching you. And I remember by the time the next morning I was going there to kind of pick up some of those ashes, there's a part of me that was almost kind of just smiling and laughing, like, what is this? Like, life is such a joke if you get deluded into thinking that the identity of this person was just the body, because it was not just the body. I felt so deeply convinced from within that my father's spirit is still alive and it has just gone somewhere else from where, it has been. And that was just so intuitively clear to me. And yet, on the other hand, how instantly within just a day or two, the body could just completely disappear. And so anyway, so that experience was so rich for me. And,
Profound.
yeah. And so I really related to that part of the conversation you had. And I'm really applauding you for inviting us into that, uncomfortable space, and less talked about space of sort of what is our relationship, culturally, emotionally, etc., with the process of passing. And I'd love to have our audience hear a little bit of sort of your sentiments on that and, why you think it's important.
Well, these defining moments of our life cycle, there's a reason why we, in every faith tradition, have rituals around birth and death. And I think that for some reason, culturally, we have not allowed ourselves to get comfortable with just how natural a part of our life cycle death is. And we have not built the kind of capacity to grieve and to support our rituals, new rituals around grief and loss and embracing these very natural parts of the human experience. I have a friend named John Powell who is a social scientist at UC Berkeley, and he talks about how there's two kinds of suffering in the world. There is a kind of suffering that is sort of a natural part of the human experience. We will all experience grief and loss and disappointment and heartbreak and death at some point. And then there's a kind of suffering that is not natural at all. That is the result of systems and policies and decisions that we as humans have made to structure the world, to create order, and it is often created and reinforced hierarchies of human value and human experience in our world. And these unnecessary forms of suffering, like he would say that there's no reason why a single child should live in poverty in the United States of America with so much wealth in our country, that is an unnecessary and unnatural form of human suffering that we have created. The good news about that is that we can change. If child poverty, and we actually proved this when with the child tax credit, when a huge number of children were lifted out of poverty almost overnight because of the child tax credit, that we can actually make a different set of choices. And with death, it is like death is an inevitable part of life, and there will be suffering around it. But the kind of suffering that is a result of denial, failure to prepare or accept that it is a natural part of life, like that's cultural dynamic that we have created that we can change because we as people embody culture and change it every single day. And so I feel very hopeful that as we live longer and more of us are facing these stages of life for longer lifespans, that we can change our cultural norms and our deeply seated feelings about aging, about caregiving, and about death. And when we do, I think so much of the unnecessary man-made forms of suffering we will release. And I'm really looking forward to that day.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And let's now pull back into, before we get to that stage, there is this phase of aging where at times disability or struggle physically, or mentally comes to us, and that's going to keep out of your focus to help put a spotlight on what are we doing as a society to really be more mindful of the way we come together in engaging and supporting that generation who has reached that stage. You have this thing that you call the caregiving majority framework, and I'm going to quote from something you've shared. You've said, we have to engage all of the communities that are impacted by the elder boom: care workers, senior groups, disability rights advocates, women's organizations, unions, communities of faith, youth, and students. This is the caring majority, the powerful intergenerational alignment of American experiences that represent the full diversity of who we are as a nation, with unlimited potential to change the political landscape and the basic value that connects us all, which is care. What I really love about that is how you're taking something that sparks you, and then you're inviting us all to be part of that, and not just because that's your cause, but by alerting us and reminding us that that's the natural cause and that's everyone's cause. So beautiful. But talk a little bit more to us about what is it that, for those of us who not really paused and thought at this stage of their life, or haven't really been thrust into a role yet, why is this something that we should be consciously really investing in, thinking about our values and our attitudes and our practices and the policies around us, etc., around care?
Mm. So, from the time we're born to the time we die, we rely on the care of others. We are unique as mammals, human beings, because we actually need the care of another adult human from the time we come out of the womb, in terms of feeding. And we can't even start walking until, 9 months or however long, which is unusual for mammals who walk. um, and so care is a pretty fundamental part of the human experience. And by care, I mean the child care that young children need, that really does nurture their potential in life from the time that they're born, to disability care, the kind of supports and services that allow children and adults of all age, people of all ages, to live whole lives, contribute, be a part of the community, be a part of society, regardless of the disability that they may have, whether they have an intellectual or developmental disability or a severe physical disability. They're still able to live a whole life because of care. Also, as we age and we become more frail or we need more assistance with basic activities of living, that is also care. And so whether you're in a facility like an assisted living facility or a nursing home, or you're receiving care in the home from a family member or from a professional caregiver, this is all forms of care. And oftentimes it's a whole bunch of different places that you're getting care from. It's family members, it's friends, it's community, and it can also be professionals. There's this famous quote by the former First Lady Rosalind Carter, who said there's only 4 kinds of people in the world: people who are caregivers or will be, and people who need care or will need care. And what I love about that is that it really does make it clear, so clear, how much this experience of care will at some point, if it doesn't already, connect us. And in the United States, we, among all advanced countries in the world, are pretty far behind when it comes to building the kind of policies and systems that will support people with this very fundamental universal need. And we have a culture in our country that tells us that caring for our loved ones is really just a personal responsibility, that families should just manage it individually. And if you can't afford your care or you can't find it or manage it, that you did something wrong, seen as a personal failure because you don't have the right job, or you didn't buy the long-term care insurance, or you didn't save enough. The reality is most countries actually have programs that help middle-class families afford childcare, or they have a long-term care program that's a part of their healthcare system that makes long-term care more affordable and accessible. Or they have a paid family medical leave program that allows working-age adults to take time away from work without having to worry about losing their jobs or their income to care for a loved one. And we don't have any of those policies or programs in the United States. In fact, we're one of 2 countries in the world with no national paid family medical leave program. And so if you're struggling, if you are caring for someone, or you yourself need care and you're struggling, please know that it is not your fault, that we as a society we are behind. We have not built the kind of systems that support American family life, to be honest, in the modern age. And that is why I think this idea of the caring majority is so important. The moment you start to see yourself as a part of this massive constituency of 105.6 million people who are currently caregiving in our country, you start to realize, okay, 1, I'm not alone. And 2, this force of 105.6 million people who are currently today caregiving in one form or another is unstoppable. I mean, this is a massive, um, massive number of people in our country who are directly experiencing this need. And if we harnessed that energy, could do amazing things, including remake our social contract and our commitment to care in our country.
You have been bequeathed with some really special gifts. You're doing this beautiful work. You are conceiving it strategically, and you're also just a great articulator of it. Just the way you sort of phrase it, talk about it is I think very stirring for so many. I can only imagine how many how many people's hearts and minds you've changed. I noticed that one of the things you talked about is also how much that act of caregiving actually ends up really benefiting the caregiver themselves. Talk about that a little bit to us.
Oh, I talk to caregivers every day who talk about finding their calling when they became caregivers. And I was just in a meeting last night with a group of caregivers who were talking about some of the challenges of navigating systems that we have in this country. And one of them said, I do this because I love my mother. This is a role that I have taken on because of love. And that reminder, and the fact that she has organized her entire life around loving out loud. The practice of loving her mother every day is a profound choice. And if you allow it and support it, it can change you in beautiful ways. And I think I see that every day from caregivers. And I mean, in this age of loneliness, where loneliness is an epidemic declared by the Surgeon General in terms of the harmful health impacts that it has across the board beyond mental and emotional health. The one of the main prescriptions our Surgeon General before had, Dr. Murthy, he said, was to really connect with a sense of purpose and be of service. And that is what caregivers do and are every day. It's such purposeful work and purposeful relationships. And what's so fascinating is I often hear caregivers say that they go into a caregiving relationship with a certain set of assumptions about who is the caregiver and who is the care recipient. And then immediately they realize that the person they're caring for is also caring for them in all of these ways. I met this one home care worker from the Philippines who was caring for a woman who was going through cancer treatment through chemotherapy. And then in the midst of the caregiving relationship, as she was healing and recovering and her cancer was in remission, the caregiver got diagnosed with cancer, and the care recipient coached her and held her hand through the entire process. And that kind of reciprocity and human interdependence is so life-affirming. It's so powerful. Two complete strangers from different parts of the world can become one another's most important person. That is, to me, a beautiful thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. I've been studying the pursuit of excellence, and I've been studying change making and leadership. A few of the usual suspects show up, like a Mother Teresa or Monet as a painter, or a Gandhi and what have you. And in studying their lives and seeking to, as best I could, stepping into the shoes for a moment, step by step, one thing I realized is that, they were obviously like loving people, but they were actually in love. They were in love. And that made it easy to be loving because you're basically in love. Monet basically said, I perhaps owe it to flowers that I became a painter, because I can't help it. When I see them with the ravishing beauty that they have, like, I have to paint them, And Mother Teresa also exemplified that so much in her work. Just the friend of mine, dear friend, she was on this podcast. Her name is, Jeanette Petrie. And she and her sister went to India, and, after the Mother Teresa won the Nobel Prize and all of that, and said, like, we should make a movie on, like, this is such a beautiful institution, what she's doing. And she, gave them permission. And so they spent 5 years making a documentary on Mother Teresa. And then she was so swept off her feet that she just, after that, quit everything in New York and just said, Mother, how can I serve you? I just want to be with you. And she spent the next 10 years with her as well. So 15 years overall.
Wow.
Mother's passing, and from the stories she says, but also from just the video documentary footage that we can bear witness to ourselves when we watch it, which is such a blessing to have. Most strikes my students, for example, at Columbia in the executive MBA program, I share that, that documentary at times. And what's most striking about it is that, like, you see how much Mother Teresa is in love, is in love with these people that she's serving. I have very rarely found anybody articulating that as a core principle of their movement. And so it was such a joy for me to see that in you, that, you have also discovered that truth. And while I'm just a teacher of that truth, you are actually a practitioner of that truth, which is lovely, right? And you're validating it even more, the translatability of this idea and anything and everything that is noble and important in the world. So can you talk a little bit about this? You talk about how you believe that love is the most powerful force for change in the world. So
yeah,
what is this idea about, like, being in love?
It is an enduring source of energy, of hope, of perspective. For example, true outrage, the root of outrage. And this is how movements can be anchored in love. Social movements that are outraged at injustice, that come together where we actually bear witness when we bear witness to an injustice, the root of it is a deep love for humanity. Rage is different. And that to me is the kind of outrage that is rooted in love actually builds. The kind of rage that is rooted in a sense of, I don't know how to express where rage that is not rooted in love comes from, but it flares out and it has lots of casualties. And I think that organizing with love allows us to organize from a place of seeing one another's full humanity, whereas rage tends to dehumanize. And I don't believe that you can build movements if you are dehumanizing others. And in fact, so many of the root issues when it comes to injustice and inequity in our societies, it has its roots in dehumanization and a story about one group of people being less human than another. And I think love is the only truly universal force that helps us stay outside of that paradigm, because it's a very powerful paradigm and reminds us that we are first and foremost all human with inherent dignity and worth. And that to me is the most powerful ground to both endure in good work, but also to keep focus on what might be possible for human beings in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to soak in. I'm not in a rush to continue because I just want our audience also just to pause and take in, the profundity of what you're saying. It's beautiful. I'm reminded of how inspired I was by studying Gandhi's movement. And the principle it sort of helped me conceive is that, there's all kinds of change makers out there. And some of them are actually really very empathetic and caring and connected and committed to like a community, a cause. But what differentiates those that I think leave like a really timeless footprint in the sands of time is that they tend to, not to your point, like separate, that group from the rest of humanity and say like, in doing for this group, I don't care what judgments are passed on the rest of humanity or what, I inflict on the rest. This group is so much pain. This is all I'm concerned with, and the whole world should be concerned with this, etc. They're able to simultaneously keep their intent focus on that group, but at the same time, that expansive lens, on the whole world, right? The dual kind of, frame. And so in the case of Gandhi, what that meant is that, yes, he wanted the British to like surrender power and walk out of India and not anymore continue to, extract economically from India and all of that, and give India its, rightful, opportunity to lead and govern itself and all of that. And what he wanted the British to do that. Now, in economic terms, you might consider that a zero-sum game, as they say. But what he was saying is actually this is good news for you. He was telling the British public, he was going to Britain and saying like, this is the right thing for you. Why? Because in doing this, you might be getting economically richer, but you're getting morally poorer. I care for you and I love you. And I see so much goodness, when I come here to the United Kingdom about the way you live and what you do and all of that. And I want you to kind of advance, morally and spiritually. And you're bankrupting yourself by doing this. So, so in other words, what I see in these people is a capacity for a certain kind of transcendence where there is a sense that when I'm fighting for justice, even for a community, it cannot be in net negative for the rest of humanity, because the universe just doesn't work that way. The solutions that we have to forge are solutions which, they may not necessarily help everybody equally materially, but if some people have to sacrifice materially, it will be for their own moral gain or something like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it really does. And I think that there's such a valuable framing. The world is only zero sum when we buy into a narrative that somebody told us. At the end of the day, that isn't how the world works. And we are actually interconnected and interdependent. And And even the moral bankruptcy or the moral losses of colonialism have real material consequences. It's not just a spiritual. And so, yes, I think that that's a really, really profound insight that you just shared.
Hmm. Well, you say some of this so beautifully. You talk about how much of an irony it is. I mean, I'm now paraphrasing you. I don't remember your exact words, but how much of an irony it is that in the caregiving world that you have these caregivers, often, low-income immigrant, folks with less qualification, etc., who are sometimes not given their due. And yet, here they are touching and supporting, your loved ones at the most vulnerable moments of their life.
Yeah.
And you need them there to do it in the most loving way, a gentle way, a caring way, attentive way, and mindful way, and all of that. And yet, so how could it happen that there should be tension and conflict in seeking to support their rights in the more traditional labor union kind of management wars that happen? So again, I was paraphrasing you. I did a very imperfect job of that, but can you articulate that a little bit, because it's really a wonderful framing that I think would help so many of us in other arenas as well, to recognize that when you're fighting for something or against something or whatever, keeping that larger war in mind rather than just the battle of ultimately wanting to keep the relationship whole.
Yeah. Well, I learned everything from domestic workers in this, in terms of how change happens. I mean, just think about the fact that you have a nanny in New York City who goes to work. She leaves her home in a neighborhood where she has to share a room with 4 other people or 3 other people in order to just afford the rent. And it's way out far from where she works in Manhattan. And so spends about an hour on public transportation, has to take a bus to get to the train to get to Tribeca, where she works. She arrives on the scene and she finds a shopping bag, and there are shoes that cost more than she earns an entire week. And yet her job is to show up and care for those children, to be the first responder before the first responder, to nurture the human potential, to love that child into being an adult. And she does it. And that is her day, every day. Then after work, she gets back on multiple forms of public transportation only to see her own children just before they go to bed, and repeats it again. And the fact that caregivers have that capacity to know, to live every day on both ends of the economic spectrum, her life and then the life of the people that she works for, she knows that reality so intimately, and yet she lives such a different one. And inside of that, she can still give so much love and care to that child that child will remember her forever and always, and will want that nanny to take care of her children when she grows up and finishes college and has her own family. And I have seen that story so many times. That is not an outlier. That is the reality of so many domestic workers in this country. And that capacity to show up and care and do your work from a place of love, no matter what, even if you are being valued at less than a pair of shoes, if your contributions are being so devalued that you don't have a single paid sick day, that you can still do that, is really just a testament to our capacity to have empathy and to be generous and to be caring. And that gives me hope. And that is powerful. Now, how we organize that energy and that capacity, and how we organize it enough so that we can change things to value that work in a different way, that is what I've spent the last 28 years trying to figure out, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there must be countless people who have been so positively impacted by that. I want to share a quick story with you related to what we are just talking about. So Winston Churchill, I don't know if you know this about him, but he had a tough time growing up with a father and a mother who were both very busy with their affairs, in the world, all the things they were doing, politics and society and all of that. He ended up really yearning and hurting for wanting that paternal and maternal affirmation and love and security. Yeah, and ultimately the person who really gave it to him was his nanny. She was the one who really ultimately raised him, and it was a very close and dear relationship for him. Everest, was the name, Elizabeth Everest, and he considered her to be almost sort of like his most intimate friend. She was a constant companion to him as he was growing up, and I think he was about 21 when she passed away, and it really sort of was a moment of great grieving and loss for him, and he then started to pay from that day on for a certain stone, on her tombstone and everything, and anyway, so I wanted to kind of just share that as a backdrop to this idea also that when you talk about caregiving in particular for that role in the home, where it's a nanny, doing it for your kids, I wonder if it's also important to have us recognize how formative that stage and age is for any of us.
Absolutely.
And then essentially, this is my hypothesis that the energy that person is bringing into the home, the mood, the aura, the intention, the love, the care, support, or the lack thereof, doing it mechanically and transactionally and professionally and politely, but fundamentally not being fully there, right? I mean, anyway, on that spectrum, now we do all aspire for having the right nannies, and most of them who are drawn to it as a choice, as a profession, are coming into that natural heart, the natural gift of that. But in some ways, the greatest and most lasting and enduring gift that they might be giving, your family and the child, might be beyond just the material upkeep, of that little, fragile life, is the deeper inner kind of foundation stones that are being set up, in that person.
Absolutely. No, there's so much that we know. There's so much research that we know now about that 0 to 3 window, that where just so many of our neuropathways are being formed at such an incredible rate. And for so many children, the one adult who is with them day in and day out is the nanny. And so that role is just so profound in terms of the imprints in a child's life. And I remember in New York, which was our first campaign for a domestic workers' bill of rights, one of my favorite hearings was a hearing where a young woman named Julia Steele, who had been raised by a nanny, came to testify about this very thing of what it meant for her, whose mother was always away working. She was a photographer to the stars. This Jamaican immigrant nanny who often took her home to Brooklyn to her own family's residence on the weekends when her mother was away. This role that this person played was so profound that she was still in regular touch with this nanny and wanted to make sure that the City Council of New York really understood that this is the work that makes not just New York City function every day, but generations of people, putting them on a track to realize their potential in the world. And I just thought it was so moving.
Yeah, well, I feel moved now just hearing about that. That is so beautiful, and it's such a thoughtful way to seek to create influence with those stakeholders, that you can have all the bars and charts about sort of the economics and the the demographics of caring and all of that, but then there's just these lived stories, and
Yeah.
and what a story, what a story for her as an adult now, just talking about how formative that was and central that was to her. Yeah, that's beautiful. Who has shaped you and your thinking, inspired you the most? Is there an individual or a group of sort of folks that you have found most exemplary or instructive in the art and craft of sort of bringing positive change in the world?
One person who came to mind is a woman named Dorothy Lee Bolden, who was a domestic worker in Atlanta in the civil rights era. well, we're still in the civil rights era, but in the 60s and 70s. And she was a neighbor of Dr. Martin Luther King's. And as the momentum on the civil rights movement under his leadership was building, she went to see him and knocked on his door and said, the domestic workers want to be a part of this movement. This is about us. And he said to her, well, then organize a union of these domestic workers. And that is what she did. She founded the National Domestic Workers Union, which at its height, I think, represented over 10,000, mostly Black women who worked as domestic workers in the South. And there were two criteria to joining. You didn't have to even pay dues because most people didn't have the money. You just had to, one, be a domestic worker, and two, be registered to vote. And she just understood how important it was to be civically engaged in that way and to see your agency. No matter how little the world or society might think of you, you have your voice and you have your vote and you care. And that is important. And so I think I was very inspired by her as I learned about her in my early days as an organizer. And I've had so many important mentors along the way. I am such a believer in mentorship. And I often think if I'll have one regret, it's that I don't have enough people that I'm mentoring in a deep way. And I think that's one of my goals for this next phase of the work is to support younger organizers who are coming into this work, because I am the beneficiary of much generosity from people like Linda Burnham, who was the founder of the Women of Color Resource Center, and so many other wonderful leaders who took the time to answer my wild questions.
Sure, sure. Well, as we bring our conversation to a reluctant closure, because I know the audience just as much as I would just continue to feel so enriched with every minute and hour of our time together. But as we bring this to closure, I'd love for you to invite the first step from those in our audience who may get sparked by what you're sharing about the discipline and power and value of caring as a active value that we engage on in life. If there was one step that you might sort of encourage people to take who may either be, on the one hand, struggling with the amount of sort of burdens they're carrying, on them, caring and beyond, or those who, haven't really given this a serious look so far. What is one way they can be, in some ways, like involved in your movement without having to like pack their bags and just come over and, ask you, Ai-jen, how can I serve? Which I'm sure some of them do that too.
Well, one thing would be to just reflect a little bit on your own personal experience with care. Who have been the people in your life who have cared for you, and the meaning of those relationships in your life? And who do you take care of, or who do you anticipate you'll be caring for? And what is your hope for what that relationship will be like and feel like? And just spend a little bit of time kind of immersing yourself in your own care story. And then I think one thing I've been suggesting lately is to reach out to somebody that you know is caring for someone else. Like I have a very good friend whose husband has advanced stage cancer, and she is caring for him along with two very young children. And, I would encourage you, if you have somebody like that in your life, to just reach out and say, hey, I know you are doing a lot of caregiving right now. Is there anything I can do to offer some relief or some support to you? And sometimes they won't know the answer because a lot of caregivers they've taken on so much on their own and that they're not in the habit of asking for help or deploying help well. But I think it's a good thing it's a real contribution to get people in the mindset of receiving assistance when they're caring for other people.
Yeah. That's a beautiful step that any all of us can take, and you're actually giving me a practice that I want to sort of implement, tomorrow. So thank you so much for that. That is so beautiful. I want to end with a quote from my side, and then invite you to share, like, what is and that would be the last voice, that we want to have in this. So it should come from you, not from me. What would be your big dream, for the years ahead? Like, what is it that you are seeking to manifest? So that would be my question for you. And before that, the quote I have which comes to my mind in the context of the beautiful work and the message you have for all of us is from Rumi. And he once, the Sufi mystic from Turkey, and he once said something like, all doubt and despair and fear disappear when the whole purpose of life becomes love. And I see that in your story, the courage, the clarity, the commitment, the conviction that has emerged from a deep stirring of love from within for humanity, and for this beautiful quest of caring. So thank you so much again for coming and joining our world here at Intersections, and for all you do, and wishing you really well on this path, so luminous, that you are blazing for so many who I know are following in your footsteps and will continue to expand in the years and decades ahead. But for now, I invite you to have the last voice and tell us a little bit about sort of your dream.
Well, thank you for the conversation and for the time. And my dream is simply that we will all be able to live and to work and to age with dignity and care. And I think that we can start building that world today. One person, one call, one act of love, and eventually the force of that, with the hundreds of millions of us who are directly affected by care, will change everything.